Can you believe the sheer, terrifying audacity of the moment we are about to explore? This isn't just history. This is the story of how the greatest iron-wielding, chariot-driving civilization of the Bronze Age was brought to its knees, not by an invading army, but by the silent, crushing grip of an Anatolian winter.
In 1500 BCE, the Hittite Empire stood as a colossus, its influence stretching from the Aegean coast deep into the Fertile Crescent, guarded by walls so thick they seemed to defy the very gods of earth and stone. They were the masters of fortification, the engineers of monumental defiance against a chaotic world. Yet tonight, inside the supposed safety of the triple-ringed capital, the city of the Lion Gate, a terror far colder than the snow drifting over the citadel was about to take root. A catastrophe no one, not the great King Tudhalia himself, nor his highest priests reading the entrails, ever saw coming. Imagine the scene. The air is so frigid it cracks the moisture from your lungs, turning every breath into a dangerous weapon. The massive basalt blocks of the lower city walls weep frozen condensation, coated in layers of lethal ice. The great fortifications meant to protect now serve only to seal the doom within. Inside the city, the populace huddles. They trust the towering fortifications, the famed postern gates designed to funnel attacking forces into killing fields. They trust the massive grain silos dug deep into the bedrock, supposedly provisioned for years of siege or famine, based on meticulous cuneiform archives. But trust is a fragile thing when the temperature plunges so low that the very olive oil used for lamps refuses to flow. This isn't merely cold. This is the merciless grip of the Anatolian plateau, magnified tenfold by a season history would later forget, a season of utter despair and lethal miscalculation. We are focusing on the whispers, because in a rigid hierarchical society like Hatti, fear doesn't scream, it crawls along the frigid paving stones, carried on the breath of starving guards. The official enemy was always defined as the Kaska tribesmen, wild, mountainous raiders who would descend like wolves during the thaw. But the true enemy this winter wasn't external. It was internal, and it was tied directly to the meticulously managed logistics of their imperial survival. Can you fathom the hubris? An empire built on meticulously recorded treaties and ironclad law, believing they could legislate away the power of Mother Nature herself. They calculated the yield, they measured the consumption, they stored the bronze, but they forgot one terrifying variable: human corruption and the deadly amplification of scarcity. They forgot that the greatest threat to a colossal structure is always wrought at the core. The great king was sealed away in the upper city, a magnificent fortress within a fortress, warmed by brazier fires, fed by wood dragged in months earlier. He sees the city below as merely a successful operation, a collection of flickering lights sustained by his divine grace and engineering prowess. But down in the lower districts, among the common laborers and the essential artisans, the very backbone holding the empire's infrastructure together, the terrifying truth was already manifesting. The official report from the temple of the storm god had been doctored. The grain stores were not sufficient. A terrible miscalculation. Maybe even a deliberate sabotage orchestrated by a jealous cousin in the royal line had cut the expected reserves by a staggering 20%, a number hidden behind layers of carefully forged clay tablets. 20% might sound like a statistic, but in a city packed with thousands, sealed off by snowdrifts taller than a man, 20% means slow, agonizing death for thousands. It means the rations of the bronzesmiths, the people who forge the weapons that defend the capital, are about to be halved.
It means unrest, which in a military state translates instantly to lethal rebellion. The first sign was the disappearance of the essential winter watchmen patrolling the outer walls. They weren't killed by Casca arrows, they simply vanished into the snow, driven by desperation, or perhaps silenced by someone who knew the terrible secret they were about to expose to the hungry masses.
The tension was palpable in the barracks of the Royal Guard, housed just below the citadel. These hardened warriors, the elite Mekki, chariot drivers and infantry, were trained to face the massed armies of Egypt or the disciplined forces of Mitanni, but not this slow, creeping paralysis of hunger. Their loyalty was to the king. Their faith was in the storm god Teshub, but their stomachs were beginning to betray them. The rations were shrinking, and the subtle shift in the quality of the preserved dried meats, now laced with grit and filler, was noticed immediately by men whose lives depended on peak physical condition and razor-sharp reflexes. The commander of the gate, a veteran named Pihunya, had watched the carts coming and going from the main silo, and the mathematics simply didn't add up to the official tally stamped on the clay tablets. He knew that questioning the royal scribes was often a quicker death than facing a Casca blade. But the alternative was watching his own men turn on each other, dissolving the military order from the inside. This fear, the fear of internal collapse, was the one vulnerability the Hittite Empire had never truly fortified against. They built walls against men. They failed to build walls against the brutal, unrelenting truth. Tudaliah, the great king, slept fitfully, troubled by dark omens. A dead falcon found frozen on his windowsill, the persistent, low rumble of the earth that the priests dismissed as seasonal shifting, but Tudaliah feared was the very foundation of his dynasty giving way beneath the ice. He demanded constant reports, yet those reports were polished and filtered by a court determined to maintain the illusion of omnipotence. The vast, echoing stone halls of the palace became chambers of mirrors, reflecting only the desired image of power, while the reality outside was a landscape of brutal, unforgiving starvation and impending civic war. We must understand that for the Hittites, their cities were not just centers of power. They were meticulously engineered islands of civilization against the terrifying anarchy of the mountain tribes and the unpredictable climate. When the island starts sinking, the rules of civilization dissolve with terrifying speed, faster than any army can march. Prepare yourself to witness the fall of the great king's peace, shattered by the bitterest winter anyone had ever known. All while the magnificent stone lions at the gate stared silently out
at the gathering, deadly snowstorm. The true siege had begun, and the walls were no longer protecting them. They were merely sealing the fate of the entire empire.
The heavy bronze doors of the great palace slammed shut, not against an enemy, but against the biting, invisible foe that had already slipped past the triple fortifications of Hattusa. Inside the towering stone labyrinth, King Telepinu sat upon the basalt throne, his face carved into a mask of impenetrable, ancient authority. But even the divine protection granted by the storm god Teshub seemed to have deserted the vast, wind-swept halls, leaving behind only the chilling reality of mismanagement and deceit. The flickering oil lamps cast dancing, frantic shadows across the carved reliefs of victorious wars, cruel mockeries now that the empire was losing the war against simple survival. Telepinu knew the truth, whispered in the servants' quarters, long before the vizier dared to speak it in the official council. The winter stores were not adequate, and the road to the Taurus Mountains, the essential lifeline of grain, was now a solid, impassable grave of ice. The sheer scale of the Hittite capital, this magnificent, sprawling metropolis built from cyclopean blocks of stone, had always been its greatest boast. Now, it was a colossal logistical trap, requiring thousands of mouths to feed daily just to maintain the peace and the illusion of power among the countless bureaucrats and fighting men. Down in the lower city, far from the polished marble floors of the high temple, the true heart of the crisis was festering in the colossal subterranean granaries. These massive silos, designed to hold enough barley and wheat to withstand a decade-long siege, were ironically crumbling under the weight of their own compromised contents and the silent betrayal of their overseers. The head of the royal supplies, a nervous man named Zidanza, had been given the impossible task of inventorying the disaster. His scribes working feverishly by torchlight, their breath clouding the stale air of the storage chambers. What they discovered was not just shortage, but catastrophic sabotage masked by sloppy record-keeping, the age-old, rot-inducing crime of the middlemen. Mold, black and aggressively pervasive, had devoured almost half of the carefully stored grain sacks, the moisture seeping in from cracks in the foundation that had been ignored during the hasty pre-winter construction rush. Zidanza's gut twisted. This was not purely an act of nature, but a calculated theft, where spoiled grain had been used to replace stolen, high-quality rations destined for black markets outside the city walls before the snows hit. He gripped his stylus so tightly his knuckles turned white, knowing that reporting this level of high-level corruption meant immediate, agonizing execution. But hiding it meant the rapid starvation of the royal army and the citizens supporting it. This silent choice between personal short-term survival and the total imperial collapse was the daily, deadly currency of the freezing Hittite bureaucracy. The Grand Vizier, a cold, calculating man named Kantuzili, was already maneuvering, sensing the scent of lethal weakness surrounding the king's immediate circle, and preparing his own ascent to ultimate power. Cantuzili understood perfectly that in a time of existential crisis, the desperate people needed a villain more than they needed bread, and Zidanza was the perfect target, too lowborn to fight back effectively, and too important to ignore in the official reckoning. He had dispatched royal messengers through the blinding white streets, their light chariots struggling against the heavy, drifting snow, carrying decrees that simultaneously mandated strict rationing and promised swift, brutal justice for those responsible for the failing stores. This was the dark, necessary art of Hittite governance: manage the perception of absolute control, even as the actual control slipped entirely away into the frozen abyss of the Anatolian plateau. The king's guards, the legendary Meshedi, the elite axemen who formed the core of the palace protection, were now patrolling the inner city, not to watch for foreign spies or Mitanni incursions, but to watch their own citizens, their faces grim, their polished bronze armor already showing disheartening traces of cold rust and neglect. Every flickering shadow became a potential conspirator. Every dropped grain of barley was now treated as potential evidence of active sedition. And the once proud, unquestioning loyalty to the king began to fracture entirely under the sheer, brutal pressure of gnawing hunger and the cold. The mighty, meticulously structured hierarchy of the empire was turning against itself, a self-destructive viper swallowing its own tail in the deepest winter dark. The massive defensive walls of Hattusa, renowned throughout the entirety of the Near East, were not merely physical barriers. They were immense psychological fortresses meant to instill unwavering, absolute confidence in the divine destiny of the Hittite people. Yet, the higher they built those incredible fortifications, the famous upper city walls reaching staggering heights, meant to mock any potential Assyrian or Egyptian challenger, the deeper the sense of isolation and finality became, now that the supply roads were completely closed. The sheer, uncompromising scale of the stone architecture amplified the profound silence, creating a hollow, echoing dread that permeated the narrow, packed streets of the capital. People looked up at the towering citadel, the sacred precinct, and saw not salvation or divine protection, but a stone monument to their own rapidly impending doom, a colossal tomb built on an unparalleled scale of imperial hubris. The Shapiluliuma Gate, usually bustling with trade caravans bringing copper from Cyprus and luxury goods from Babylon, was now sealed with 3-foot-thick ice, its legendary lion guards staring blankly and hopelessly at the unending blizzard. The only sound was the howling, desolate wind, a sound that seemed to carry the ancient curses of the subjugated lands the Hittites had conquered through centuries of hard fighting. Every breath inside the city walls became a chilling, painful reminder that the accumulated wealth and military might of an empire means nothing when the earth simply stops yielding its essential bounty. The colossal human effort required to move, store, and distribute resources across the rugged, frozen Anatolian plateau had been crushed, not by 1,000 enemy spears, but by a few degrees of relentless, catastrophic cold.
The greatest military power of the age was suffocating, slowly, silently, wrapped in the blinding white, icy shroud of a winter that simply refused to break, sealing the final fate of the city of 1,000 gods behind walls that could keep out massive armies, but not the hunger that now gnawed viciously from within.
The walls of Hattusa, monuments to absolute power, stood defiant against the blinding white wilderness, but they were now nothing more than the gilded cage for a dying population. The mighty citadel, once buzzing with the life of 10,000 souls, now echoed with a silence far more terrifying than the roar of any enemy siege engine. A silence only broken by the frantic, scraping sound of desperate hands searching for fuel that no longer existed. That silence was the sound of empty bellies and the slow, agonizing realization that the great king's stores, the supposed infinite lifeline of the empire, were fundamentally compromised. The logistical masterpiece that was the Hittite supply chain, a marvel of the late Bronze Age, stretching from the sun-drenched Mediterranean coast to the rugged, distant eastern highlands, had snapped instantly and irrevocably like dry kindling under the unprecedented, grinding pressure of this unnatural climactic disaster. It wasn't just a simple lack of grain. It was the total systemic failure. The massive oxen and horses freezing solid in the high passes. The usually subservient mountain tribes now seizing control of the choke points and demanding impossible, exorbitant tariffs for passage. And the pervasive, insidious rot that had already claimed the previous autumn's crucial harvest before the first fatal snowflake even began to descend. The king had been assured multiple times by the pompous, overly confident high vizier that the reserves could withstand a 3-year siege. An utterly catastrophic lie built on arrogance and criminal negligence that was now costing thousands of lives. The terrifying truth was that the Hittite Empire had conquered the world with its iron and its chariots, but it was being undone by a handful of empty silos. Inside the massive royal granaries, built deep beneath the citadel's impenetrable defensive layers, the High Vizier, Hattusili the Younger, paced back and forth across the cold stone floor, a frantic energy burning away the last tattered remnants of his once imposing dignity. The complex, sacred clay seals on the colossal storage jars, designed to protect the barley and wheat for 5 long years of drought or relentless war, now lay brutally smashed on the floor, revealing not overflowing golden abundance, but nothing but fine dust and desiccated, worthless husks. They had relied far too heavily on the promised spring delivery from Kizzuwatna, a lush coastal region famed throughout the ancient world for its agricultural bounty and endless fertility. But Kizzuwatna was now completely cut off, its vital passes buried beneath 30 feet of impenetrable crystalline death. Hattusili knew the terrible, unspoken truth. The quartermasters and regional governors, in their greedy haste and relentless desire for immediate personal wealth, had severely miscalculated the required reserves, prioritizing massive tribute payments to the palace over actual, guaranteed survival stock for the populace.
This was not a famine sent by the righteous, terrifying storm god Teshub. This was a self-inflicted, mortal wound, a betrayal whispered in the deep shadows of the highest court, an act of internal treason far more dangerous than any Assyrian army. But the high-ranking priests, ever keen to maintain their iron grip on order and to redirect blame, had already decreed the disaster an unholy curse, demanding massive, terrifying, and often pointless human sacrifices to appease the rapidly raging winter deity, a move that only intensified the population's silent terror and despair.
The weight of this desperate, crushing situation fell hardest and most immediately upon the common laborers and the thousands of captive foreign workers, the Gaz people, who lived in the freezing, unprotected lower city, far from the critical warmth of the sacred royal hearths. Their rations, already tragically meager even during times of plenty, were the first to vanish completely, leaving them with nothing but ice water and the bitter taste of betrayal. Fear quickly curdled and solidified into white-hot resentment. They watched the thick smoke rise perpetually from the palaces on the inviolable Citadel Hill, knowing with chilling certainty that even in this deep freeze, the ruling class was still consuming massive quantities of preserved salted meat and precious imported oils, while their own small children shivered and starved to death in the unheated barracks. Whispers, thin and sharp as ice shards, began to spread through the freezing, packed barracks, rumors of a hidden cache of winter stores, a gigantic, forgotten treasury of food, guarded closely by the king's personal guard, the terrifying Gal Maseti, elite men whose absolute loyalty was bought with endless privilege, endless food, and the promise of perpetual consuming warmth. King Telepinu, sitting upon his magnificent cedar throne, draped in luxurious furs that could clothe 100 men, felt the massive stone walls of his entire empire contracting violently around his very chest, crushing the air from his lungs. He was a ruthless man of war, accustomed to facing visible, external threats, not this silent, psychological, bone-aching dread that permeated the air like thick, poisonous smoke.
He had issued the desperate decree: mobilize every single able-bodied man remaining in the city to begin the impossible, suicidal task of clearing the mountain passes immediately, even knowing such an endeavor meant certain death for most. He needed those convoys to arrive. The very legitimacy of his divine rule, tied directly to his ability to provide and protect his people, was dissolving faster than snow in the spring sun.
But his most trusted generals, veterans of 100 campaigns, vehemently refused. They cited ancient law and the certainty of frostbite casualties numbering in the tens of thousands. To send men out now was not an act of strength or a desperate measure. It was an act of genocide, confirming the growing, dangerous belief that Telepinu was losing his fundamental divine touch, that the gods had abandoned Hattusa. The loyalty of the military elite was now hanging by a single frozen thread of silk, ready to snap at the slightest provocation.
The desperation reached its absolute, terrifying peak on the night of the broken ice, a night forever named for the moment the city's primary, colossal water cistern, located in the lower city, cracked violently under the extreme pressure, instantly flooding the lower levels and contaminating the last viable, critical drinking supply. It was the final, devastating, crushing blow that ended all hope.
The saga's workers, driven absolutely mad by thirst and maddened further by weeks of consuming hunger, abandoned their freezing posts in the western quarter. They did not march toward the city gates to flee the walls and escape the inevitable. They marched inward, toward the soft, vulnerable underbelly of the royal district, where the cisterns and the last known, rumored food stores were located. Their weapons were not bronze swords or iron axes, the tools of the professional soldier, but crude, improvised tools, sharpened stones, and the terrifying, silent, unified strength of men who had nothing, absolutely nothing, left to lose. The massive, legendary stone walls that had protected the Hittite Empire for 4 centuries were about to witness a war fought not against foreign chariots or invading armies, but against the very people they were sworn to shelter. A vicious riot, fueled by the most basic, terrifying, and primal human need for survival. The king's elite guard stood ready, their bronze armor gleaming coldly in the flickering torchlight, preparing to defend stores that might not even truly exist, knowing with chilling certainty that if they fired upon their own starving people, the fragile social contract binding the city of 1,000 gods would shatter entirely, sealing the final, devastating fate of Hattusa beneath the crushing, terrible weight of its own internal collapse.
The social contract binding the city of 1,000 gods did not merely fray at the edges. It snapped with a thunderous, terrifying finality, echoing the sound of cracking ice on the frozen cisterns where the common people had long run dry of hope. This was not a slow decay of trust, but an instantaneous, catastrophic failure of faith in the very system that promised protection in exchange for absolute obedience to the great king, the supposed son of Hattusa.
The king, seated upon his basalt throne, still maintained the outward appearance of divine power, his copper-plated armor gleaming faintly in the torchlight. But the reality was that the air in the great hall was thick, not with incense, but with the cloying stench of fear and the unspoken accusation of failure. The catastrophe had moved past logistics and settled deep into the dark hearts of the elite. The Panku, that ancient and powerful council of nobles and military commanders, whose sworn duty was to advise the monarch and ensure the stability of the realm, had transformed almost overnight into a consortium of greedy vipers. They saw the crisis not as a threat to be overcome, but as a golden, terrible opportunity to consolidate power and wealth beneath the guise of strategic rationing. They controlled the vast, subterranean storage chambers, pits carved deep into the limestone bedrock beneath the upper city, designed to hold years of grain, dried meat, and precious olive oil, the guaranteed sustenance of the empire. But now, these reserves were being measured out with a cruel, miserly hand, designed only to keep the population just above the threshold of immediate mass riot, never enough to break the famine's psychological grip.
It was calculated cruelty, a masterful demonstration of power through orchestrated scarcity, ensuring that the loyalties of the few remaining sturdy workers who distributed the meager rations were tied directly to the panku, bypassing the authority of the king himself. This was treason, conducted in the silent, freezing dark of the night, ratified by the scraping sound of shovels locking the granary doors shut.
The roads connecting Hattusa to the few remaining loyal vassal states were not just blocked by snow, they were haunted by desperation. Any caravan fool enough to attempt the pass was immediately set upon, not by foreign enemies, but by the emaciated, desperate remnants of the Hittite peasantry, men and women driven to pure savagery, shedding their civility like a worthless second skin. No vital news, no desperate plea for aid, no shipment of necessary cedar wood or copper ingots could penetrate the frozen cordon. Hattusa had become a monumental, self-imposed prison, its famous walls now serving only to seal the doom inside. The king's inner circle, the highest-ranking machete guards, once the proud protectors of the throne, were now reduced to glorified warehouse watchmen, their spears pointed inward at their own starving brethren. Their primary duty was no longer the security of the perimeter, but the ruthless enforcement of the grain monopoly, executing summary judgment upon anyone caught pilfering so much as a handful of barley flour. Suspicion was the new currency, and trust was the quickest route to the execution block. The great king, desperate to regain control of a system actively being sabotaged by his own ministers, began issuing cryptic, chilling decrees demanding the swift eradication of mismanagement. This was the code word for silent, midnight purges, where officials who failed to deliver the impossible, or worse, those who knew too much about the Pangku's hoarding, simply vanished, their names erased from the cuneiform registry. But the political decay was only the prelude to a far more visceral horror. As the winter deepened its hold and the reserves were stretched thinner and thinner, the predictable consequences of overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and spoiled food arrived with the inevitability of a vengeful god. This was the silent killer, a plague that the meticulous Hittite doctors and priests instantly attributed not to poor sanitation, but to the righteous, overflowing rage of the storm god, Teshub, punishing the city for some unknown, grave transgression against the divine order. The priests, the Sangha, were frantic. They performed increasingly elaborate and costly rituals, sacrificing the few remaining cattle they possessed, their prayers echoing against the ice-covered stones, desperate to appease the tempestuous deity before he finished his terrible work. But Teshub did not answer. The only response was the relentless, biting wind and the rising stench of decay. The scribes, the highly trained intellectual backbone of the empire, whose duty was to meticulously record every transaction, every law, and every diplomatic exchange on their clay tablets, now sat idle, Their fingers were too cold to work the stylus, and their hearts were too heavy to record the truth. They dramatically underreported the daily death tolls, crafting lies of stability and resilience for the official records that would be presented to the king, maintaining a fragile, deadly illusion. The psychological weight of this collective self-deception was heavier than the monumental stones of the fortification walls, crushing the soul of the city from the inside out. Deep beneath the great hall, in the innermost sanctum of the royal storage pits, the chambers where the king kept the sacred reserve of seed grain, the absolute guarantee of next year's harvest, the very biological future of the entire empire, a shadow moved. It was not a Panku noble, but a desperate, low-ranking guard, driven mad by the screams of his sick family and the gnawing emptiness in his own belly.
He was preparing the ultimate act of treason, an act far more devastating than any foreign invasion, to steal the king's seed, to commit not just a crime, but total civilizational suicide, guaranteeing that even if the spring came, Hattusa would never rise again.
The air in the royal granary, usually thick with the scent of stored barley and wheat, now carried a thin, metallic chill, the smell of empty space and treason. The chief steward, a man named Teshub Saruma, whose family line had guarded the royal stores since the time of Labarna, stood paralyzed, his oil lamp casting long, desperate shadows on the massive clay jars. He didn't need to count the remaining sacks. The silence of the cavernous chamber screamed the truth. The reserves were vanishing faster than the king's accountants could fake the ledgers. Hattusili, the weathered commander of the Iron Guard, felt the floor of the granary shifting beneath his boots, not from seismic activity, but from the invisible movement of organized systemic rot that was eating the capital alive from the inside out. His men, hardened veterans who had faced Casca raids and Egyptian chariots on the scorched plains of Kadesh, now looked fearfully not at the dark tunnels outside, but at each other. They knew this wasn't mere desperate theft. This was a choreographed extraction of the empire's lifeblood, orchestrated by someone who understood the logistical choke points better than the king's own quartermasters, someone who knew precisely where the weak points in the stone heart of Hattusia lay. How in a city locked down by meters of ice and guarded by double cyclopean walls towering 40 feet into the freezing sky, could hundreds of tons of dried sustenance vanish without a single audible sound of protest or struggle? The entry logs showed only minimal movement, documenting the necessary daily rations being distributed strictly to the palace elite and the high priesthood, a paltry amount compared to the total drain. But Hattusili had seen the telltale signs of the conspiracy's silent operation. The faint, almost imperceptible drag marks etched into the frozen cobblestones leading away from the secondary northern supply gate, a massive portal supposedly sealed with lead and royal decree since the very first heavy snowfall that had buried the Anatolian plateau. The conspirators weren't clumsily tunneling beneath the walls like common bandits. They were exploiting the very systems designed to protect the city from starvation. They were using the emergency fuel routes, the necessary and constant movement of vast loads of cedar logs and charcoal meant to keep the inner courts and the royal temples from freezing solid,
as their invisible delivery vehicles. Every sled and heavy cart carrying warmth out of the city was returning under the cloak of night, with seemingly empty space under the thick protective tarpaulins, space immediately filled and concealed with the meticulously bagged and stolen grain before being rushed back out through the northern gate. The audacity of the plot was breathtaking, a profound mockery of the king's authority and the gods who watched over the sacred city. They weren't just fighting the royal guard, they were ruthlessly recruiting them through the ultimate weapon: desperation. A few extra rations of dried figs, a hidden pouch of fine barley flour, a solemn promise of warmth for a shivering, starving child was often all it took to turn a loyal, oath-sworn spearman into a silent accomplice in the systematic destruction of his own civilization. Loyalty, Hattusili grimly realized, was a spiritual luxury that fathers of hungry children could simply not afford in the face of this unparalleled, consuming cold. The sub-zero temperatures were the true, relentless interrogator, easily breaking oaths that the sharpest bronze swords could never hope to cut. The deeper Hattusili dug into the conspiracy, the higher the invisible systemic rot climbed, like parasitic ivy suffocating the massive palace walls of the citadel. The signet ring he discovered discarded near the sealed northern gate, a piece of evidence carefully wiped clean but unmistakable in its design, was not from a common merchant or a low-level palace functionary. It bore the stylized fierce hawk sigil of Prince Morshili, the king's own nephew and the highly trusted chief advisor on all matters of agricultural planning and strategic resource allocation. Morshili, the man explicitly tasked with overseeing and ensuring the winter supplies, was revealed to be the meticulous architect of this silent internal siege, using his knowledge of the supply chain to turn the city's strength into its greatest weakness. The greatest, most immediate horror was the necessity of approaching the great king, a man already visibly weakened by the constant, dull ache of his own failing health and the overwhelming, crushing burden of ruling a world seemingly frozen into permanent silence. To tell the ailing sovereign that his own flesh and blood, his successor and trusted advisor, was systematically murdering the empire from the inside out, would risk plunging the fragile, fearful court into immediate, bloody civil war, a conflict Hattusili simply could not survive, while it lay buried under 10 feet of paralyzing snow and ice. Hattusili knew he had to move instantly and decisively in the deepest shadows, forced to become a lethal conspirator against the original conspirators, fighting a secret war in the sacred halls of power, where the only effective weapon was absolute, chilling, and swift secrecy, executed without the king's blessing. The stolen grain, the very vital seed of the empire, wasn't just being hoarded for personal wealth. It was being moved with incredible speed and efficiency outside the capital's control, traveling toward the peripheral vassal states who had long grown tired of Hattus's arrogant dominance and heavy taxes. These wary vassals were now being secretly promised a full granary and future protection in exchange for immediate military allegiance and the promise of betrayal when the spring thaw finally came. This wasn't mere treason for power or wealth. This was a meticulously planned geopolitical strategic move, financing the next devastating civil war with the very food meant to keep the royal line and the whole of the Hittite people alive until the next harvest. Hattusili knew the terrible truth. The moment he struck against Prince Morshili, the fragile peace and the pretense of royal unity would shatter instantly, unleashing a horror far more devastating and swift than the slow, grinding death of winter. The clock was ticking, measured not by the arc of the sun, but by the rapidly dwindling weight of the king's remaining seed. The fate of the entire Bronze Age power rested on whether Hattusili could break the betrayal before the last kernel of grain vanished into the hungry darkness.
The silence within the mighty halls of Hattusa was not peace. It was the suffocating absence of hope, a vacuum only filled by the rasping breath of King Hattusili. His bronze crown felt less like a symbol of power and more like a frozen shackle chaining him to a dying city. The intelligence reports were grim, etched onto clay tablets that seemed to absorb the last vestiges of warmth from the torchlight, confirming the horrifying reality. The missing grain was not lost to bandits or blizzard, but systematically stolen. This was not petty theft. This was the calculated decapitation of an empire's lifeline, executed by someone who knew the exact calibration of their demise, someone high enough to manipulate the most sacred logistical networks of the kingdom. All eyes, the few, desperate eyes that still dared to look, turned toward the chief administrator of provisions, a man named Pitana, whose lineage was as ancient and stony as the walls themselves, and whose greed was boundless. Pitana, always too smooth, too quiet in his declarations of loyalty, now found his name whispering through the frostbitten corridors like a death curse.
Hattusili knew that moving against Pitana without irrefutable proof would shatter the already fragile political stability. It would be the civil war the devastating winter secretly craved. He needed an undeniable paper trail, a smoking arrow pointing directly at the heart of the betrayal, before he could unleash the hounds of justice.
So, in the dead center of the bitterest night, when the cold outside made the very stones of the fortress weep ice, he summoned Arnuwandas, the royal scribe, whose fingers were numb, but whose mind was a burning abacus of stored memory and ledger entries. Their mission: track the phantom shipments and prove the crime of high treason.
The scribe worked in a buried archive, a subterranean vault where the temperature barely hovered above freezing, surrounded by thousands of years of recorded history that felt suddenly worthless against the specter of starvation. He meticulously compared the daily intake logs from the crucial harvest months against the official disbursement records signed by Pitana himself. Hours stretched into an eternity of agonizing scratching stylus on damp clay, while the king waited above, feeling the weight of the city's hunger pressing down on him like the lid of a stone sarcophagus.
Then, the horrifying, blinding truth materialized, not in a single dramatic declaration, but in a series of discrepancies, too vast, too audacious to be accidental. Pitana had systematically inflated the inventory needs of a remote fortress in the far southeastern marches, a strategically minor location essential only for appearances, demanding supplies far beyond its meager capacity. This distant stronghold was called Zipalanda, a name that now echoed with ominous treachery. The critical fact, the key that unlocked the betrayal, was that Zippalanda had been officially abandoned, stripped bare of troops and closed 3 seasons prior during the seasonal troop rotation. It was a ghost fort, a bureaucratic blank spot.
The grain, enough to feed Hattusa for 2 critical, potentially fatal months, had been marked for a garrison that did not exist. Its destination, a geographical lie, now secretly housing Pathana's own private army of desperate, well-fed mercenaries. These men, loyal only to the gold Pathana had siphoned from the royal coffers, were waiting, perched like vultures, for the capital to starve itself into submission. This was the terrifying moment of realization. The betrayal was not just theft, it was a prelude to open conquest, a calculated coup d'etat masked by logistical failure. Hattusili felt the rage course through him, a temporary, blazing shield against the encroaching cold that threatened to numb his will. Pithana had gambled everything on the king being too paralyzed by logistics and climate to strike back, believing the weather was his impenetrable ally. He was catastrophically wrong.
The king's response had to be surgical, immediate, swift, and utterly silent. A single mistake, a single misplaced whisper, would alert Pithana, who still sat in the inner council, radiating false concern, and mean the swift death of every citizen behind the great walls. He could not spare the main army, frozen in place by the blizzards that had sealed the mountain passes, nor could he announce the mission without fatally compromising the element of surprise. The king chose his most trusted asset, the Storm Guard, a hand-picked unit of silent, obsidian-armored veterans, notorious throughout Anatolia for their unbreakable loyalty and their terrifying ability to move across impossible, snow-choked terrain. Their mission was simple in concept, but suicidal in execution. A 3-day forced march through the most dangerous, blizzard-choked passes to Zippalanda. They were to bypass the fortress, eliminate the hidden guards, secure the grain, and ensure Pithana's hidden army starved before they could march on the capital. The equipment was minimal. Leather tunics stiffened with ice, sharp iron tools to cut through packed snowdrifts, and small, low-slung sledges pulled by oxen whose breath instantly frosted the frigid air. They moved out under the cloak of a moonless night, the snow already waist-deep in the outer courtyards, and the chill factor lethal. Every single step outside the colossal protection of the monumental walls was a gamble against instant freezing death. The Anatolian plateau in midwinter was not merely a landscape. It was a hostile god, waiting for the slightest sign of weakness, the smallest hesitation, to consume them whole. They were navigating by memory, and the faint, almost psychic understanding of the land possessed only by these hardened veteran soldiers. Their biggest, most immediate enemy wasn't Pithana's hidden militia. It was the sheer, brutal, suffocating silence of the cold that promised to freeze their blood solid before they reached the first major mountain pass. They had to move fast, without fire, relying entirely on the desperate, feverish rhythm of their own pounding hearts to generate enough heat to survive the night. Meanwhile, back in the capital, Pithana sat in his lavishly heated chamber, calculating the minutes until the inevitable collapse of the king's authority. He believed his plan was flawless, his hidden reserves untouchable, secure in a fort no one would ever suspect was active. He smiled, a thin, chilling curve of the lip, imagining the king's desperate surrender, anticipating the moment he would ascend the throne. But even his immense icy confidence was beginning to fray at the edges. Why was the king so quiet? Why hadn't the royal guards started seizing assets yet? The unnatural lack of reaction was more terrifying to a conspirator than a direct, brutal confrontation, suggesting a silent, tactical move he couldn't predict, a counterstrike forming in the darkness beneath the blizzard. He sent out trusted scouts, hidden men planted deep within the city's watchtowers, ordering them to report any unusual movement, any clandestine gathering of forces. But the city was a tomb, its inhabitants too weak and cold to stir, a perfect, frozen facade of compliance that hid the deadly, impossible operation already underway miles away in the mountains. The storm guard, moving like ghosts across the treacherous, icy slopes, knew they were not just raiding a stolen granary. They were carrying the last, fragile, desperate hope of their entire civilization on their backs. If they failed, Zipalanda would become the launch pad for a devastating assault, ending the Hittite kingdom not with the glorious clash of chariots, but with the whimpering death of mass starvation. Their swords were drawn against the elements and against the unbounded greed of a traitor. Their mission a desperate race against the final, fatal winter solstice, proving that sometimes the mightiest empires do not fall to external armies, but are simply betrayed, stone by agonizing stone. The true cost of their survival was now being paid, drop by agonizing drop, on the frozen trails leading away from Hattusa. The true silence that descended upon Hattusa was not the lack of battle cries, but the profound, echoing sound of empty stomachs bouncing off the cyclopean walls of the citadel. The betrayal on the frozen trails had done its terrible work. The last meager caravans, those vital arteries of survival, carrying the grain of the fertile lower lands, had vanished into the blinding snow, intercepted not by the Kaskin tribesmen the king dreaded, but by the very officials sworn on sacred oaths to protect the imperial supply chain. This was treason of the highest order, an imperial wound that did not gush red blood, but bled slowly, internally, freezing the heart of the empire stone by agonizing stone. The great King Mutwatali was being starved into submission by his own servants, a fate more humiliating than any military defeat the new kingdom had ever known. The finger of suspicion, cold as the iron of the north, pointed relentlessly toward the single most powerful bureaucrat outside the immediate royal family, the overseer of the royal granaries,
a man known in hushed, fearful tones throughout the city as the Silent Reaper. He wasn't stealing for mere personal greed or luxury. He was hoarding for absolute power, weaponizing the winter itself.
He understood the terrifying fragility of centralized authority. He knew the great king's command rested entirely on the illusion of endless provision. And when that illusion shattered, the massive bronze doors of the royal palace would not hold back the tide of desperation. He was leveraging famine to dismantle the throne, piece by brutal piece. Mutwatali paced the hall of the 12 gods, his bronze staff striking the polished floor like a death knell in the oppressive quiet. Every face he saw was a potential assassin, every loyal nod a hidden dagger. He had survived foreign wars, devastating plagues, and generations of rival princes, but he was being choked by numbers, the terrifying, mathematically precise, dwindling count of his remaining winter stores. Hattusa, magnificent and seemingly impregnable, was fundamentally a trap. Its monumental walls, designed to keep the world out, now served only to hold starvation in. It housed thousands of elite charioteers, scribes, bureaucrats, artisans, and their families, a logistical pyramid that required constant, massive influx of calories just to maintain the status quo, a flow that had now been violently severed by the Silent Reaper's cunning.
Unlike scattered, self-sustaining villages that could forage or hunt small game, the capital was utterly dependent on the official centralized flow of resources, a flow that had not merely been disrupted, but violently diverted into private, secret caches miles from the city gates. The rationing decrees became daily acts of psychological torture, read out in the frozen courtyards under the pale, unforgiving sun. First, the reduction of the common soldier's ration to a bare handful of barley. Then the devastating cut to the artisan class, the very backbone of the empire's production. Then came the horrific edict concerning the sacrificed animals. Nothing was allowed to be wasted. Not a sliver of hide, not a drop of blood. Even the bone marrow was scraped out, boiled down into a bitter, life-sustaining sludge that tasted only of regret and dust, mixed with water and prayer. The priests of the storm god, Teshub, were working overtime, praying for a thaw that never came, reading the sickly livers of the few remaining sacrificial sheep for signs of imperial redemption. But the omens were unequivocally dark. The true omens were etched not in entrails, but in the sunken, desperate eyes of the children huddled near the braziers, in the rising tide of petty theft that now incurred the penalty of execution, and in the growing hostility between the upper city, the nobility, and the lower city, the common folk. The collective nervous system of Hattusa was fraying, stretched taut like a frozen bowstring ready to snap. The nights were filled not with the typical urban clamor, but with a profound, terrifying stillness, punctuated only by the shallow coughs of the dying and the relentless, grinding sound of the king's desperate accountants trying to make 2 barley seeds equal 5.
The unbearable reality was the certainty that the supplies existed. They were merely diverted, sitting in some frozen, well-guarded warehouse just beyond the empire's immediate reach, held hostage by the ambition of one cold, calculating man. Mutwatali knew he could not launch a formal military campaign.
His weary, frost-bitten legions would desert or turn on him before they marched 10 miles in the face of the overwhelming snow and the systemic logistical collapse. The treachery was too deep, the supply chain too broken. To fight the silent reaper who controlled the very logistics of food and fuel, he needed a ghost, a weapon that moved in the shadows and required no cumbersome supply train of its own.
He summoned the man known only as the Scorpion, the grim, silent commander of the Royal Guard's clandestine arm, men whose loyalty was bought not with coin or grain, but with the king's personal, terrifying guarantee of swift, absolute vengeance against all enemies of the crown. These men were the empire's unseen teeth, the ones who dealt in clean, quiet death.
The mission was simple, brutal, and utterly essential for the survival of the new kingdom. Identify the precise locations of the secret caches, eliminate the traitors and the silent reaper without noise, and, above all else, secure the remaining winter stores before the spring thaw revealed the full, catastrophic extent of the royal weakness to the surrounding, eager vassal kingdoms. This was no longer war. This was silent, internal execution, designed to cauterize the fatal wound the empire had inflicted upon itself. If the Scorpion failed, Hattusa would not merely starve to death. It would tear itself apart, stone by stone, under the crushing weight of its own failed ambition and the sheer, overwhelming psychological horror of being betrayed from within. The cold air now tasted of metal and impending doom, and somewhere, miles away in a well-stocked fortress, the silent reaper smiled, watching the capital city slowly freeze and die, unaware that the king had just deployed his last, most dangerous viper into the endless white silence. The fate of the entire Hittite empire now rested on a handful of shadowed men, navigating the treacherous, snow-choked valleys of Anatolia, searching for the stolen bread that stood between the new kingdom's survival and its utter, icy annihilation. The shadow operatives, led by the stoic High Steward Pyasura, pushed deeper into the blinding white hellscape. They were no longer walking on the famed, sun-baked Hittite roads that crisscrossed the plateau. They were swimming through drifts taller than a man, each step a testament to desperation and frostbite. This wasn't merely a patrol. This was the last, desperate throw of the dice by a dying king, gambling the empire's future on finding a few hundred bushels of stolen barley before the city's heart stopped beating entirely, and the walls of Hattusa became a tombstone for a forgotten age of glory. The temperature had plummeted to a level the ancient records rarely dared to describe, turning breath into instant, lethal shards of ice that sliced at their lungs. Every metal object, from the bronze tips of their spears to the clasps on their heavy wool cloaks, radiated a deadly, bone-deep chill that promised a slow, agonizing sleep. They traveled under the spectral light of the Anatolian moon, which seemed only to illuminate the endless, terrifying uniformity of the snow, hiding every treacherous crevasse and every potential ambush site with equal malice.
Pihasura knew that the thieves hadn't just taken the grain. They had deliberately chosen the precise moment when the great roads, the vital arteries of the kingdom, were choked, paralyzed by the sudden, unprecedented fury of the blizzard. This was not simple banditry driven by hunger. This was calculated treason, aimed at maximizing the famine's grip and forcing the reigning king to face a fatal popular revolt, fueled by starvation and hysteria.
The psychological warfare was brilliant in its cruelty, horrifyingly effective, and pure, unadulterated evil. They were hunting not just a stolen resource, but the very mechanism of the empire's self-destruction, engineered by one of its most trusted and highest-ranking officials from within the royal court itself.
After 4 grueling days of travel, skirting the edges of the vast frozen salt lake, where the wind howled with the voice of 1,000 demons, they found the first undeniable, damning sign. It was a deep, unnatural depression in the snow, consistent not with regular storm debris, but with the massive, dragging weight of a heavily laden ox cart struggling off the main path. And nearby, half-buried and almost impossible to spot, was a piece of finely carved cedar wood, unmistakably belonging to the royal granary wagons, marked with the signet of the great king himself. This was confirmation beyond doubt. The supplies hadn't been lost to the storm. They had been deliberately rerouted, dragged off the main valley roads towards the unforgiving, isolated crags of the eastern Taurus Mountains. A death trap disguised as a temporary storage facility, engineered to let the capital starve while the supplies remained agonizingly close.
Pihasura realized the chilling genius of the betrayal, almost certainly masterminded by the king's own quartermaster general, the highly ambitious Lord Hattusili. The plan wasn't just to steal the food for personal gain. It was to let the king watch his people die of famine, while the stolen bounty remained just outside the gates, tantalizingly close, yet absolutely unreachable in the choking, deep winter snows. The men were rapidly running out of their own meager provisions. The small pouches of dried figs and cured goat meat were dangerously depleted, and the immense energy required to traverse the knee-deep compacted snow consumed calories at a terrifying, unsustainable rate. They were now operating purely on the adrenaline of necessity, fueled by the terrifying, chilling knowledge that if they failed, the thousands trapped behind the magnificent, useless stone walls of the capital would die screaming from cold and hunger. The silence of the high plateau was suddenly shattered not by the routine whistle of the wind, but by a sound far more ancient and terrifying, the ragged, desperate howls of a great pack of starving Anatolian wolves. Driven down from the mountains by the same crippling famine that paralyzed the Hittite state, these enormous apex predators saw the search party not as heavily armed men, but as moving sources of warmth and potential sustenance. Pihasura ordered his men into a tight defensive wedge formation, their bronze shields glittering briefly and ominously in the weak moonlight, knowing that this was a fight they couldn't afford to win slowly or with excessive effort. Every minute spent battling the furious, desperate animals was a minute closer to the final, total collapse of the city that depended on their success. The clash was swift and horrifically gruesome. The wolves, emboldened by overwhelming hunger and the strong scent of human exhaustion, threw themselves mercilessly at the flanks of the patrol, their teeth bared. Swords flashed with brutal efficiency, meeting sinew and thick fur with sickening, bone-jarring impact. Wiping the steaming blood from his blade and ignoring the throbbing, agonizing pain in his own frostbitten fingers, Pihasura forced his gaze back to the faint, yet still discernible cart tracks leading inexorably toward the highest, most treacherous peaks. They had survived the immediate, visceral threat of the starving pack, but the truly lethal enemy, the organized treason that sought to starve the entire nation into submission, still lay hidden ahead, somewhere high in those frozen, silent, unforgiving peaks. The search was no longer just about recovering stolen bread. It was about tearing the heart out of the conspiracy before the sun rose again over a capital city that might already be too far gone, drowning hopelessly in its own icy despair and internal betrayal. The final, desperate race was officially on, pitting the loyalty and sheer endurance of a few good men against the overwhelming conspiratorial might of the brutal Hittite winter and the deep-seated rot of treason.